Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The Metaverse Connectivity Summit is starting shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. The Metaverse Connectivity Summit is now starting.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you guys enjoyed the food. It looks like some of the other guys are still doing it. We're going to start with the afternoon session. Hope you guys enjoyed also the morning panels and so on. We're going to talk about enabling innovation in the metaverse. For that, I want to welcome on stage Caitlin Kalinowski from Meta. Caitlin, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. I'm Caitlin Kalinowski, and up until April, I was responsible for the hardware for VR, and so I just brought this for fun today. This is the new Meta Quest Pro. And it just came out, and I think people just started getting it this week, so we're really excited about this product. But we're here to talk about the future of the metaverse and networks. And infrastructure as a service is going to be a huge part of the future of the metaverse, but also critically important so we can make the best of the resources that we have together. This discussion that we're going to have is going to be focused on metaverse-enabled networks and innovation in use cases, but also monetization. And it's Meta's strong position that in order to enable these future use cases for the metaverse, whether it's VR, AR, or mixed reality, in order to enable these use cases, we're going to have to significantly reduce the latency of our networks. In addition, we're going to have significantly more distributed networks. And so in order to discuss this topic, I'm really delighted to introduce three gentlemen with me into the discussion. Rodrigo Broilio has more than 20 years of experience in the industry. Over the past 7 years, he's served as a senior leader within the Edge organization at Meta. And this is where he leverages his broader understanding of both infra and business to guide Meta's long-term Edge strategy. He currently serves as tech lead for multiple distinct functions, including preparing the metaverse readiness of Meta's Edge network. Sama Naguib, who we're delighted to have on stage, leads network transformation business development for Amazon Web Services Telecom business unit. He's responsible for strategy and planning for AWS's wireless and wireline public and private network solution area. As a telecom industry veteran, he's passionate about helping communication service providers and enterprises realize the promises of 5G by leveraging AWS cloud innovations. And finally, last but not least, Jefferson Wang. He leads Accenture's new global 5G and networks team, uniting over 8,000 network resources under a common vision that modern network connectivity is a new competitive differentiator, and I believe it is, that will improve lives. The practice helps communication service providers, network equipment providers, hyperscalers, and G2000 enterprises with industry-specific network solutions from plan and design through build and run. And so I'm delighted to welcome these three gentlemen to the stage. Hi.
Thank you.
Welcome. Welcome. Hi. Hi. Please be seated. Okay, so we're going to talk about a bunch of fun topics today, and we're going to actually start on infra and latency. And I think latency is a critically important topic. So I'm going to ask the first question to you, Rodrigo. How do you feel that Meta sees the evolution of your peering strategy to support metaverse use cases requiring lower latency?
So first I want to start with this statement that Metaverse is about multiple companies, right? It's not only about Meta. And is the connection between people and people to the edge, right? And our vision and about how can we achieve these low latency requirements, the new requirements for the Metaverse, is like we need to expand our infrastructure beyond the traditional interconnection centers that we have today, right? And our networks in a given market, they should be able to interconnect between each other. And what that means is not only the CSPs with with Meta, but I mean between everyone, right? So they should be able to interconnect to provide this like lower latency between people and also between the content providers, but all content providers, not only Meta. And we have been working very hard to improve the ecosystem itself, right? So we have been partnering with the Internet Society, right, to help scale the internet exchanges worldwide, and also with our carrier-neutral data center partners, advising them where they should build like neutral facilities that will help not only Meta, but other content providers and the CSPs in a neutral environment to be able to interconnect. That's our like vision for the future of the peering ecosystem.
Thank you. Sama, I'm curious, do you have the same definition of edge as Rodrigo? And how do you think about this? I'm interested in, of course, deploying networks, supporting low latency. What is your position, and how do you see this in the future playing out?
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. Edge is a very near and dear topic to myself and to AWS, because when we look at edge, metaverse, and networks, we think that they are all connected. If you tackle this from network and mobile operators' perspective, mobile operators are transforming their networks fundamentally to be able to enable new use cases. And the most exciting new use case for customers are related to edge. So when we talk about metaverse, edge is all about bringing the latency down so that you can enable things like AR, VR, and mixed reality. And edge is not just about bringing the infrastructure closer to the user. We see edge, it's about bringing the whole end-to-end closer to the user, which means that the network, they have to scale down. They have to be able to also dynamically be placed. So as the users move, for example, you need your network access points to move. And then you need edge solutions that not only provide infrastructure, but provide innovation platform. And this is where it becomes very interesting for us from AWS perspective, because our vision is bringing edge means bringing the entire cloud closer to the users, right? And this is where we look at not just the infrastructure. Infrastructure is a key component, but we look also at bringing the platform, bringing common APIs. Because for innovation to happen, developers should be able to have access to a common platform, common services, common API, so that they can develop the application in the cloud, in the region, where it's easier, and then they can deploy it selectively on the edge. Not only deploy it selectively, but deploy even components that require the low latency at the edge, and then maybe other components that are not that latency sensitive can be in the region. So we look at the edge from the lens of a cloud continuum, where we can help mobile operators bring the network down closer to the users, and bring the innovations also through the developers. So it's very important to us. I will talk about other things related to use case later, but the whole thing is the cloud continuum, one set of APIs and service wherever you are.
And we might want to back up. I have a follow-up question. Could we define the edge and what you see as the edge, just to back up a little bit? I know we have a ton of specialists in the audience, but there might be someone who doesn't have that background, that knowledge.
Do you mind just saying the question one more time?
Yeah, I'd like to define what we mean when we're talking about the edge on this panel, just for the audience, just in case.
Sure. So basically, when you think about the edge is the ability to process your data closer to the consumers of the data. So if you think about networks, for example, connectivity, the consumers of the applications are you and me, right? Or actual mobile consumers who, through their devices, whether it's your Meta Quest that you brought, or whether it's mobile devices, they need to access an end application. This application could be a gaming application, a VR application. So if you think about it, from where you stand to where the application sits, you need a very low latency, which means we call it edge because we think about this is the network, right? So the more far you are from the user, the more centralized you are. The more closer you get to the user, we call this the edge of the network. And that's why we call it edge.
Thank you. That's perfect. And I'm going to get to Jefferson in 5 seconds. But of course, as a device person, we also have a node on the device. So we've got a node on the device, we've got a node on the edge, and then we've got a node on the network. And I strongly feel that in order to enable the future of the metaverse, we're going to have to use these nodes in different ways than we do now. So I'm curious about Accenture's point of view on this, and in particular, supporting operators in provisioning and monetizing metaverse-related services specifically. But I'd love to hear your point of view on this.
Yeah, I think that also when you think about edge, there's also the location, right, and how close it is on near or far, and that's probably something we need to consider. If that physical distance is what we're really focused on, what does that mean in terms of that? And then we can start to define this as a platform on storage and compute. But, Caitlin, you mentioned, how does it affect the device? How does it affect the application? How does it affect the solution? I think when you look at a platform, you think through, if edge is a new platform, how does it service each of those? So I'll give you some examples on things that Accenture are working on. So in the device space, right, when I was building smartphones and devices, energy density of batteries was a big issue. And anytime you turn on a GPU, your battery is just skyrocketing downwards. So if you can actually move some of that compute to the edge, can you change your battery life? Also, just BOM of a device, right? Your bill of materials on a device, roughly anywhere from 10 to 20% can be in display, depending upon the type of device and the form factor. If you can actually change some of this and move some of this to the edge, and you're processing it in real time, or you're able to have a network that's strong enough to do that, can you actually start to take cost out of the device? Can you start to improve battery life? Can you start to affect the actual form factor itself on weight, on those pieces? So I think that it can serve the device from that standpoint. When you look at the edge and how does it service, let's say, kind of an overall network, cloud continuum is a great word to call it. Accenture defines the continuum as kind of public cloud, and then private, and then everything in between as this continuum, as you had mentioned. Now, when you look at how does edge service that, an incredible amount of intelligence has to go into the edge to be able to decide what to cache, what to move, what to actually distribute back to the device or the solution itself. So that's an exciting part when you think about what the network can do, a part of this. And then when you look at kind of the application layer, being able to figure out same types of decisions, right? But when you're processing data very close to the user, that's when it becomes much more valuable. That's when it becomes more useful. Like we mentioned, that physical distance changes. So when you look at edge as a platform, it's exciting because it can service the entire value chain, but can also actually impact the entire value chain on all these different business models that are going to happen.
Yeah, I love hearing you talk about device weight, battery. This is my world. And VR is challenging, getting the weight right, distribution. And we're actually looking at nodes even on the device. Is it in the front or is it in the back of the device, for example? And with AR glasses, it gets much harder because you just have a smaller form factor. And so in order to do what we need to do in AR glasses, we have the same or even harder latency problems because you can see the world in AR and you need to match the real world. In VR, at least you aren't necessarily seeing the real-time world. You can have a processing layer between. Latency becomes even harder on AR devices. And so one of the challenges we have on both VR and AR is on-device latency is low milliseconds. And ideally, in terms of SLAM, which is just using cameras to know where the device is looking, sometimes almost down to 0 with good anticipation. And this is the world that I'm in. It's like low millisecond latency. And so I think you're right. In order to actually figure out, networks aren't going to be able to do 0 millisecond latency. So figuring out how we think about the architecture of these new devices is just going to be different than mobile. It's going to be different than anything else. And my big challenge personally is we could do a perfect job in AR glasses and make the hardware perfectly right. But if the network's not ready, you're going to turn around the corner and suddenly you're not going to have the context that you wanted or the directions that you wanted, and therefore the device is going to not be able to do what we need it to do. So this is why this is so exciting for me, and I'm so excited to be here to talk to you all about it. Let's talk about graphics rendering. Maybe for you, Rodrigo, I'm curious about how we're going to move graphics rendering close to the edge. I understand it conceptually, but when you really think about the kind of latency we're going to need and the kind of graphics that these devices require, fairly complex in many cases, how do you think that this is actually going to play out? I know it's a difficult question. We can't predict the future, but we got to start building.
So I think, in fact, we already started that. So we started about 2 years ago with the product that called Facebook gaming. So we need to render part of these games on the cloud, in our infrastructure, right? So we started a few years ago already deploying this compute that will be able to, and is able to already, to process and enable these new use cases. And we are actually evolving and learning with that, because it's like a new journey, right? Learning with that to expand this footprint globally. So we are actually doing this already, because we need to support this with optimal QoE. Otherwise, if you're using a shooting game, so you click in your a mouse or keyboard, and 2 seconds after something happened, it will not be a good experience, right? So. And
we're seeing video games move to this model, and so latency is important there too. So I'm sure that we can learn from that as well.
Correct. So.
And I'm talking about PC-based games.
Yeah, PC, and as you said, AR will be a game changer on this requirement. So we are working towards to be ready when it happens.
Any thoughts, gentlemen, on this topic? How are we going to get latency down where we need it?
Yeah, so just to follow up on when we talked about edge and latency, I think one thing we sometimes we miss is latency is not just about putting the application close to the edge. It's about putting the network at the edge, right? And if you look at the way networks are built traditionally, they don't enable such low latency. So as an industry, we want to bring the applications, but we want to help also the providers of the network elements to scale their network down so that you can deploy it with very small footprint. Otherwise, you don't get the end-to-end latency. This is one thing I wanted to follow up on. And you talked about edge and its importance. And the way we look at bringing edge is, I talked about cloud continuum, but if I have to double down a little bit on this, the way I see this is you need developers to be able to access the same capabilities at the edge. But the way to do this is not just to bring the cloud, but also to bring an ecosystem, a marketplace, right? And one of the things we have been doing is we have this marketplace of applications, and we are thinking about the same marketplace should extend to edge applications and should bring the developer tools which enable these applications. This is another key aspect of the edge, in our opinion.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it that way, bringing the network to the edge, but of course that's got to be a big part of the solution. What would a network architecture look like? What does that actually mean physically?
Yeah. So if you look, for example, at 5G being one of the key enablers of low latency, one of the innovations in the 5G architecture is to separate the control plane from the user plane, which means that where you process the data is no longer tied to other control plane aspects like mobility and subscription data and so on. And in this, we call it CUPS architecture, control and user plane separation architecture. In this separated architecture, you only have one hub between the user, between the radio, and between the edge application. This one hub, we call it user plane function. And so think about an architecture where you have your mobile phone or your map or your Quest, and then you have a radio tower, and then you bring this one hub right next to the radio tower. Maybe you have a cell site and you put it at the bottom. And you bring a cloud device, which is one server, two server, multiple servers, and you have a very small footprint of this one hub. You put it there, and next to it, you put the edge application. This is how the end-to-end looks like. Now, as your user move, the network allows this hub, this user plane function, to actually continue moving while maintaining your connectivity. And then this is where the network exposure via APIs becomes very important because when the network is intelligent enough, it will tell the application that, hey, my subscriber is moving, the network is moving, now I need to move the application that is serving this subscriber from this location to that location. So these are some of the innovations that 5G brings with the network architecture. That's very critical to provide this end-to-end user experience.
And in the future, last follow-up, in the future, do you think that the backhaul, the back end of the networking will also have to move closer?
The back end of the network. Well, it really depends, right? It really depends on whether you need it closer or not. Because the edges also, the resources are important there, right? Are scarce. You don't want to put everything close to the edge because you don't want to spend more than needed, right? So you put only what's needed. So the back end aspects that could be needed maybe to influence these decisions can move, but what's not needed should stay in centralized locations.
I think that's part of the challenge, right? There's so many different ways to solve this, and we're in a world where we don't have a lot of time to explain these things, whether it's to an end user, whether it's to a board that needs to make an investment envelope decision, or whether it's the engineers, right? And yet, in this example, we can solve this in 4 or 5 different ways on the architecture, and that's part of the challenge is because we have all these options, it's taking us a little bit longer. But at the same time, these technology decisions can really decide winners or losers. Because if you end up trying to go too far on the edge and your OpEx is too high and you didn't need to, well, now you're running an inefficient business, or you've decided to put too much on board to the device and now you don't get user adoption. So I think that that's part of the challenge, I think, for all of us in the room to figure out is, you know, for every type of use case or classification of use cases, where is the optimal point of edge? Because we define it all differently. Some of us define it on the hyper edge, some of it define it on the far edge, and it really depends on what we're trying to solve for, what industry or what group we're solving for. All that has implications, all that has technology decisions, all that has, you know, implications to that. So I think that's part of the challenge with this, that there's so many ways you can solve this.
I fully agree with you, and I think that one fundamental problem that's slowing innovation is one key part of this chain are the mobile providers, the communication service providers who provide the network. Without the network, you cannot enable edge. And the fundamental problem is the communication service provider, when the earlier generation like 4G came in and enabled a lot of innovation, they were pretty much in the middle without much revenue uptake. So I think one key thing we need to do is collectively, we need, and this is something we always do with our communication service provider partners, how we can enable them to go up the value chain and become a fundamental player, not just doing the connectivity, but also enabling some of the innovation. And this is where also communication service providers themselves need to start thinking about themselves more than connectivity providers. They need to get into creating applications, or at least enabling the creation of applications.
I want to get into innovation next, so hold that thought just for a second. I'm curious, just Jefferson, as you're responsible for building the teams now, who are going to consult with many of us on the future, how are you thinking about building those teams? Like, where are your investments? I assume that, you know, thinking through this, you're going to invest in the places where you think we're going to need the most help. Those of us that, you know, of course, your company and my company work closely together as well. So I'm curious how you're building your team to anticipate what the future needs are of the companies that you're working with.
That's a great question, right? I mean, I think that the tech is really exciting and it's really good to discuss, but I think the team supporting the tech is something I think we're all very concerned with. So if you look at the evolution of some of these trends, let's say this network now becomes more software defined to be able to deal with the flex up and down of these requirements, more symmetrical, we have to think about these things. Let's say we move some of those virtualized pieces into a cloud environment, whether it's on the edge or centralized on the edge or in data centers, then you think about this is really traditional network engineers that now need IT skills. I mean, that's a great point that you just brought up, that those aren't natural things that fit together. So now you've got a network engineer that understands RAN transport core and now has to understand CI/CD, has to understand release management differently, has to understand these IT pieces differently, opening up your APIs. Like, that's not something normal for a network engineer. Generally, in a closed network, you want to keep this contained because you're trying to keep, you mentioned CSPs, we're trying to keep a 5 nines reliable network. You don't open up APIs and still expect to keep a very reliable network. So these are unnatural muscles that need to be developed on talent. Yesterday, I don't know if anybody heard at Happy Hour, but we announced that TIP plus Vodafone plus Accenture created something just for that called TIP Academy, this online training academy that can kind of fuse the network engineering with the IT skills so that we can upskill the entire industry or help, whether you're a post-grad, whether you're a network engineer that's trying to actually get into this new space when you look at 5G and all these pieces, or even if you're just trying to actually be a job seeker. So it's pretty exciting to think about, I don't want to say network is cool again, but I think network has this moment, and we're at this inflection point where it's really, really important.
And I'll reflect back. Is any difference in your answers for this question of how do you build a workforce ready for this future metaverse, ready for this the distributed systems we talked about? You're both building teams, so the way that I would look at this is we're actually going to have to both architect the system as well as the investments in the people at the same time. That's difficult when you're going 0 to 1. And of course, we're going 0 to 1 in devices. But if we don't go to 0 to 1 in network as well, we're not going to win. So I just find it interesting. Anytime we go to 0 to 1, the assumptions that you have won't necessarily hold. And the ways that you did things in the era before won't necessarily hold. The hard part is figuring out what the differences are going to be and what they're not going to be. So I think it's an interesting question. Let's move on to innovation. This is a fun one, which is really, we're going to end our last section on innovation, which is what is the future going to hold and how do you get ahead of it in any way you can? How do you start to think, okay, how are all these different pieces going to work together? And what can I do to get my company, my team, my product ready for them? So I'll go to Rodrigo first, if I can. And I'm just curious, do you have interesting examples of the way that you're looking at innovative solutions, supporting metaverse use cases? What are the metaverse use cases you're most excited about? How do you see the future here?
I think the distribution and the agreement of what the distribution means, the far edge and the edge, is like is something that we need to get collectively together, because we may have understanding like one company going that direction, another company the other direction. So it's something that we really need to get in an agreement with our players. And the distribution of the network, we tend to think only about like the wireless part, like the 5G, but you have the broadband also, right? So how can this, like we call it the breakout of the IP on the mobile network, how can they be more similar or match with the broadband networks, right? And then we can establish an ecosystem there. We can have the cloud and the infrastructure of like our companies be able to interconnect together. It's like a challenging, and another thing is if we think today that's like the content delivery networks, to deliver like a video, you likely can deliver like far away. So the latency is not like a huge requirement for delivering video. But if you go and talk about like real-time communications, so then is a different topic. So then we need this breaking out the network closer to the user. We need the edge more closer to the people. And as I think you heard in the day one, TIP, so they announced, the TIP community announced that they're developing like solutions to help address this, right? With these decentralized network architectures that we need to build together.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited with AR glasses about communication and real-time communication, but also contextual based on AI, hopefully contextual information. I think that's really interesting. Whereas VR, and I don't believe these two will converge. Personally, I believe that they're actually really distinct technology spaces. Whereas VR, I think, is, of course, it's fun for gaming, I've had my staff meeting in VR every week for years now, but I also think it's going to be great for productivity. Of course, that's part of the use cases with the Pro. But we do historically in hardware think about siloed networking capabilities, siloed standards. It seems to me like we're going to have to start mixing and having a sliding scale on how we transition, because if you transition from one type of getting information, whether it's Wi-Fi or 5G or whatever it might be, it's kind of easy to do that seamlessly because you have one stream of data coming into a computer, and it's not going to be as jarring. But if you're walking around on the street and suddenly you lose network capability, solving that problem is going to take all of us together, because it'll take the application layer all the way down to the network to figure out how are we actually going to enable use cases that require fairly consistent connectivity for the end user in a use case that requires, okay, I'm always getting information from my environment, reflecting it back. I'm curious, maybe Jefferson, if you have thoughts on this. Actually, this is a question to the whole panel about how we're going to work together to make this work.
It's probably the most important question we'll talk about here, because since we can solve it in so many different ways, and you just described the stack on where we can solve it, that's where we have to figure this out fast. Because everybody right now is gently defining with gray area what their position is. Okay, this is the component manufacturer, this is the device manufacturer, this is the distribution, this is the network, this is compute and storage, this is the analytics, this is the actual application space and user space. And all of us are trying to figure out what gray looks like, because everybody is expanding in that value chain position. So when you really think about how we can work as an industry, it can't just be the definitions of the op model, because I think that's the first point of this, is the op model definition has to be right. The business model is the most challenging part to this, at least in our experience, that figuring out where the business models and the revenue shares and where all of us can rise up, that's the hardest part, because it's natural, it's human nature to be a little bit selfish in these positions right now. And if you can't figure out the op model, the business model is very difficult, and vice versa. So I think that's really important for us to figure out, that if we believe that this post-smartphone world is going to happen and we want to accelerate a post-smartphone world, that was a very clear value chain, and that made a lot of sense on those value pools. But in this world, it's not as clear because our use cases are so different. If you look at, I'll just give you 3 examples of use cases Accenture's working on. One is, okay, post-pandemic, home becomes more important than ever, and there's people who can't leave their homes to actually get to the doctor's office, or they're just not allowed to go. So we're working with an insurance provider, plus Accenture, plus a communication service provider, to actually do an AR version of in-home diagnostics. That could never have happened if the insurance companies were 5 years ago, because that was just a liability. They didn't want to take it. Now, post-pandemic, that value chain changes. So now we can start to, and we're going to start to announce these developments of home health, right? So that value chain is very different. When you look at kind of a B2B2C model, Accenture's working on education. So we're working with very large higher education campuses to figure out what is an optimal network to cover a college campus. That's not something that's very easy. And in that, how do you innovate on a private network for certain parts of the research and development? How do you deploy Wi-Fi for the general consumption? And then how do you have other parts of the actual fiber in the backhaul for very, very low latency things that we need to work on? That's more of a a B2B2C model where it's really focused on the education side of things. On the enterprise side of things, Accenture's working with G2000 enterprises to figure out what is the best way to use VR. We know the metaverse is coming, and is it just training? Is it digital twin? So we've got multiple projects right now to actually take VR in a training environment and figure out how much more effective it is than a computer-based training. And when you look at that, all those value chains are different. All of that requires collaboration. And our role right now is sort of like ecosystem orchestration almost, because it's not defined yet. So we're trying to just orchestrate the consumer ecosystem, the B2B2C model, and the enterprise model, so that we can try and figure out how to accelerate the industry.
I think it's so important to talk about money here. Revenue, sharing revenue, and making sure that each layer of the stack is incentivized properly to make the final use case for the customer as good as possible. So this is a topic I definitely want to get into. One of the things we were really surprised about in VR when we shipped the Quest 2 is suddenly everybody was starting to do fitness in it. And it just hadn't occurred to us. Of course you'd want to do fitness in it. Just like, of course, you could use your cell phone once we got GPS to order a car. Of course. But it doesn't hit you right at the beginning. You don't recognize that for a little while. And so it's been really fun to see all the different use cases people want to use. And then we try to adapt to that, those use cases. So this is a part of innovation that's so exciting to me. It's like you've got new capabilities. You've got the ability to see your world and respond to it. You add an AI layer on top of that and innovative interaction models, which we're working on. And who knows what's actually going to happen. We've got to be ready for when that use case hits, it's going to take off. I'm really excited about it. But let's talk about revenue. I'm curious, specifically, Sema, what your thoughts are on revenue and monetizing the future of the metaverse and how you think about that.
Yeah, I think obviously, what you described about the clarity of the business model is key. But one of my main concern, as I alluded to earlier, is how can we make everybody in the value chain incentivized to help with innovation? And because I work significantly with communication service providers, this is always top of mind for them. As I mentioned, when 4G came, and by the way, innovation happens also when you create the platform. So when the smartphones came, nobody expected what kind of applications would come. But then you don't undermine the innovation of people. People innovated. But the problem here is communication service providers who, through their networks, enabled this value chain. Like you cannot do an Uber if you don't have a 4G LTE flawless, right? You cannot, same for all other applications. But communication service providers who enabled all of this actually didn't benefit much from it, right? So my main focus here is, as we get into the metaverse and the edge applications, how can we help these communication service providers to transform from what we call telco to a techco? So they should think about themselves as they provide the network, but they also enable innovation. And this is where a lot of culture and organization changes need to happen. But I think we are all people at the end of the day, and we want to do what's exciting, what's fun, right? And there is a lot of exciting technology there. And we need to help these organizations and these companies to get their people into the next wave and build new things. I think this is key. Just one fun thing when you asked Rodrigo about one exciting application. So one exciting application or use case that it's not directly metaverse related, but it's edge related. And we defined near edge and far edge. And I would call this like very far edge. So recently, AWS, we worked with NASA. And we sent one of our edge computing platforms to the space, actually. And if you think about it, and I'm just telling you this because when you enable the platform, the innovations come. So think about the amount of data processing that needs to happen in the space. And if you rely on satellite, I mean, it doesn't work, right? But suddenly you have an edge computing with analytics and machine learning, and you can do all of this on board. So this enables a lot of innovation in space. So I think similarly, once we build the platform and enable innovators, developers and innovators, they will come and they will build new use cases that we might not even envision now.
That's great, the final frontier. I love it. Well, gentlemen, I just want to thank you all. This has been such a fascinating panel. I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm really excited to continue the conversation, actually, as we move out into the rest of the conference. So just thank you all so much, and it's been really fun chatting with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello everyone, my name is Keiichi Makizono. I'm the CIO of Softbank. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share our vision and plan for the future, centering among metaverse. Unfortunately, I will not be able to attend in person, but I'm very happy to see that this year face-to-face events are increasing and traveling to become much easier. During the pandemic, the lives of many people have changed dramatically. As a telecom company, we have recognized again that the internet and communication technology are more important than ever before in our lives, our works, and our social paths. Allow me to give a brief introduction on Softbank. In 2001, Softbank started its ADSL broadband business in Japan. Since then, it has grown along with various mergers and acquisitions. We entered the mobile business by acquiring Vodafone Japan, and with the spread of smartphones, Softbank also expanded its business and grew significantly since then. Softbank has many customer touchpoints, smartphones, including social networking, smart home payment, e-commerce, search engine, news, and so on. Our vision is to become a comprehensive digital platform that reach out to a variety of industry segments and provides digital service leveraging those customer touchpoints and technologies. The pandemic has accelerated the use of virtual space in our lives over the past few years. We can see the boundary between the real and virtual space is increasingly disappearing. And with the growth of the metaverse, I believe this fusion will accelerate it even further. We are also focusing on what kind of new experience we can offer to the users. This year, Softbank has done several trials on Metaverse. We developed our first virtual reality shop on the desktop, a Metaverse platform operated by our group company. Also, users can watch the baseball game in Virtual Payment Dome, which is the home to Softbank Hawks baseball team. Purchase NFT of precious scenes of their favorite team for collection. We received a lot of great feedback, and we believe this will help us to provide better service. Our goal is to become a hub connecting real and virtual space. It is not only experience in virtual space, but also the ability to make things in real space that can be also done in virtual space, or conversely, to make things that happen in virtual space inspire innovation in real space. For example, the result of simulation in virtual space can solve problems in real space in real time. We would like to explore and offer more and more such kind of use case. To realize the real value of Metaverse, we believe these technologies are the key. Softbank is trying to provide functions and service that can be bridged between the real and the virtual spaces. Along with IT and Telecom infrastructures to support Metaverse. We believe that the hub is the role operators should play and become the bridge between the real and virtual world. IT and telco infrastructures will also need to evolve significantly. Mobile network, which will use sub switching, need to become more internet-like data-centric packet switching network and process data anywhere. We are developing technologies necessary to achieve this. In addition, the network will become even more complex as it will have to meet conflicting requirements from various stakeholders. Conventional domain-centric manual network operator will become very inadequate. We will require multi-layer, fully automated orchestration. And since the global metaverse cannot be achieved by single operators, resource federation among telecom and orchestration coordination will also become very important. We are very willing to work with everyone to make this reality. Cloud computing alone wants to be able to meet all technical requirements of metaverse. It is not easy to create and maintain a virtual world which is completely identical to the real world, and they are time synchronized. To achieve this, massive network resource from ultra-distributed computing such as fog and MEC will be necessary, and will become the foundation for 3D CG rendering and real-time sensing event processing. We believe that fog and MEC will also play an important role in autonomous distributed processing for Web3. In addition to necessary infrastructure and resources, cybersecurity will become a very critical issue in the metaverse era. We have to protect the users and their assets in the virtual space. We believe that operators who are responsible for social infrastructure should take responsibility for dealing with these issues. Like the internet, we strongly believe that metaverse requires continued innovation in a more open, collaborative, and sustainable environment, and collaboration is the key. Let's work together to make things happen. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. It's a pleasure for me here to be able to share with you all regarding metaNesia, which is our latest initiative from Telkom Indonesia in metaverse business. First of all, I'd like to apologize that I cannot be there due to conflicting agenda, but hopefully I will still share a lot of initiatives regarding metaverse from our company. My name is Fajrin. I am the Chief of Digital and Innovation Officer of Telkom Indonesia. First of all, Indonesia, as some of you may have known, is the fourth most populous country in the world. We have over 270 million population, and that's why we also have a lot of young population. We have also a lot of islands, and as a result, we have more than 1,000 ethnic groups. And we also have a lot of other cultural heritage, including arts, batik motifs, patterns regarding cravings, and also dances. We in Telkom Indonesia, as the biggest telco company, are also supportive of these Indonesia creative talents to get acknowledged by the world. For example, there are a lot of events related to the creative industry that we have been supporting in here in Indonesia. Indonesia Comic Con, this is for creative, especially multimedia and also images. And then Game Incubator. Here we're talking about some of the people who are creating game developer. And then World Music Festival and also esports. This is new areas that we have also support in the last few years. And here I want to introduce to you our latest initiative in the creative industry, which is related to the metaverse industry. We call it metaNesia, and we have a short video related with that.
Di mana imajinasi tak ada batasnya. Hal-hal luar biasa berjalan bebas. Sebebas apa yang kamu bayangkan? Penuh imajinasi. Serta mengantarmu ke tempat-tempat yang tidak pernah kamu bayangkan sebelumnya. Pasang sabuk pengamanmu dan rasakan perjalanan seru dengan mengendarai kendaraan yang kamu impikan. Bersiaplah dengan segala hal yang tak terbayangkan. Tentunya akan membuat perasaanmu tak berhenti berdecak kagum. Membuat inspirasi semakin tak terhingga. Tempat yang spektakuler. Inilah dunia yang akan menggugah rasa ingin tahumu. Dan akan membuatmu terpesona. Kita bernyanyi, menari, di sebuah konser musik dengan suasana yang luar biasa. Berkumpul bersama, melakukan apa saja dengan siapapun, juga tempat menampung segala keseruan yang kamu inginkan. Temukan teman-teman barumu dimanapun kamu berada. Serta mencari segala informasi. Kebebasan dalam berekspresi, melahirkan semua imajinasimu, semua bisa terwujud. Lahirkan inspirasi tanpa batas. metaNesia, dunia tempat mewujudkan imajinasimu.
What is metaNesia? It is essentially Indonesia Metaverse Ecosystem Hub. We launched this just few months ago, around July 2022. It's essentially a place, a virtual place where users can visit and do a lot of things there. For example, they can visit a concert hall, they can connect with friends in social hub, they can visit a showroom like a car showroom, they can also visit the shopping mall to conduct transaction. They can play a game. They can do a lot of transactions using the NFT marketplace, like buy, sell, or trade with others. We combine these metaverse elements from creative preneurs, essentially people who are developing the assets of the digital of the metaverse, and also the marketplace. So NFT marketplace, where we essentially offer a place where people can transact, buy or sell digital things, both physical and also digital. We have also implemented some of the business models, including subscription, ticketing, donation, and also transaction. We have partnered so far with some of the clients, including state-owned enterprise and also private companies like Honda, for example, MSMEs or small medium enterprises. So these are parties who are selling the craft and also other NFTs and startups. We partner with a lot of parties as well. For example, people who are developing the VR technology, and then talents from the university, payment systems to make it possible to do a transaction, cloud provider as a backbone for the infrastructure, and also device manufacturer. This is an example of what is being offered in the metaverse, in the metaNesia, and it's already live. So in the video, you can see this is a use case from Perhutani. Perhutani is state-owned enterprise in agriculture and also related stuff. So we make it possible for them to be able to show the highlight of their products and services. This is right now the video is from Bank Indonesia, which is the central bank of Indonesia, again to showcase their services or what they do to the users. This is more detail about the car showroom, and it's already live. So if you go to metaNesia, you can actually check this out yourself, where we essentially provide a place where users can visit the showroom and then check their dream car, and then they can check from the inside, outside, from above, from bottom, from in front of the car, from behind the car, and the customers can also do a test drive as well. So we partner this currently with Honda. Obviously, later on, we also want to expand the partnership to other cars as well. But for now, we have a partner with Honda. And the business model is essentially we are providing commission or lead generation for Honda, right? So for people who are interested to know more about the product or who are interested to buy the product, after they see the car, they can just fill the form. And then if there is an actual transaction based on that, then we will get some revenue sharing from Honda. This is another example of the use cases that the company can actually conduct in the metaNesia, i.e. developing its virtual branch. So Perhutani, as I mentioned before, our company itself, Telkom Indonesia, we provide a virtual customer service where people can go there and then ask the customer service agents of Telkom regarding Telkom products. Bank Indonesia or Central Bank of Indonesia, as I mentioned before. Biopharma is also a similar use case where people can ask about biopharma or their products. Biopharma is state-owned enterprise in pharmaceutical industry. And then last, also we have Garudaku, which is Indonesia Esport Association, where people can reach out to them and then find relevant information that they want to know more. Another use cases is what we call a virtual concert. So we actually have conducted some concerts. Pusakata and Fidi Aldiano are some of the local or Indonesian artists who have been performing in metaNesia. So essentially, this is similar to concert in offline, but it's done in metaverse or in virtual, where people pay a certain amount of fees for them to be able to present or to join the concert in dedicated time and space, so to say. So when people go there during the actual time, then these performers will perform there in the metaverse, right? This is also another use cases of the metaNesia that has been live, i.e. phygital or physical digital marketplace. Essentially, as a SME, you can serve or offer your products both in physical and digital form. So one of the most common example is a T-shirt, just like mentioned here. So in this T-shirt, what does it mean that we can offer both physical and digital? Is that in the metaverse or in metaNesia, you choose your own avatar, right? You can select whether you have dark hair, blonde hair, or others, and also choose what kind of outfit that you want to wear in the metaverse, right? But similar to physical or offline world, where you can actually also choose what outfit do you want to wear. So phygital here means that if you buy things here, you can actually apply it to both your physical, i.e. you get a physical T-shirt, and also your digital, i.e. your outfit to your avatar, right? So your avatar can now use the T-shirt in a digital avatar or in the metaNesia. Similarly, for other use cases, the one on the right, Bebak Kopi, this is a coffee farmer. So they offer you to buy them their coffee product, but they will give you also the digital image of their icon, so to say, the one that is shown here. So those are some of the examples of the use cases of the phygital. And what makes this interesting is that being here, being in the digital, it makes the barrier to entry is lower. So it is more suitable to SMEs, right? Because they don't need to have a lot of working capital to be able to serve their products. That's why I think this is why at the beginning I mentioned that one of the vision is to build an equal access to digital economy, because we believe that using metaverse, the barrier or the opportunity for everyone to be able to participate in this new industry or new economy is higher. And that's the reason why we want to explore this area more in the future. I think that's the end of my presentation. I do hope that we can have a exploration to explore what opportunities that we can do together in this metaverse, especially through metaNesia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Wasn't that amazing? I don't know about you, but I'm listing Caitlin as probably one of my top 3 speakers and moderators in the world, that's for sure. All right, let's do a quick thing before we move to the next section. I want to ask for a quick round of applause for the chefs and all the culinary team that built this extraordinary experience at Fyuz. They have been amazing. They fed us for 3 days. Thank you to the entire team. But let's talk now about those conversations that we are not yet having around the metaverse. And for that, I want to welcome on stage Jin Zhang, Director of Engineering at Meta Connectivity. Jin, please, welcome.
Good afternoon. Well, for the last 3 days, I have been learning a whole bunch. And why it's so important for me to come to learn? Well, I work for Meta in the area of infrastructure capacity engineering. Let me explain to you in simple terms what that means. That means my organization is responsible to make sure there's enough computers, that's both compute and storage, to support our 3 billion users, whether that's on WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, or our latest effort in Metaverse. So for that reason, I really owe a big thank you for each one of you here in the seat, because without your work in connectivity, in telco operation field here, the server that I put together is useless. And exactly for that reason, I want to come here not only to learn, but also to further discuss and join this effort together in exploring what it means to build our metaverse. Now, in order to have that conversation, there's really no better partner or teacher for me to learn from than this next gentleman that I will be introducing here. And in order to get his very impressive bio right, I decided that I'm going to hold on to my phone just so that I can read out all the proper accomplishments for this teacher that I'm going to have the honor to have a discussion with. So for this next guest of ours here, he is a non-resident senior fellow with the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institute. The Brookings Institution is very well known as a think tank here. On top of that, he is also the policy advisor to New Street Research. Now, New Street Research is a global telecommunication and tech equity research firm, right? So there's quite a bit of focus there. On top of that, this gentleman serves as an advisor to a variety of nonprofits, as well as public and private companies related to a variety of topics, such as using broadband technology to advance social progress. And prior to all of these, he served with FCC and with many, consulting for many important institutions. The important thing I want to quote before we invite him on the stage here is this particular one, or one of my favorite from Barron's magazine. It says, Levin has always been on top of developing trends and policy shifts in media and telecommunications, and has proved visionary in getting out in front of many of today's headline-making events. So with that, I sort of give out his name already. Please help me with a warm round of applause to welcome Mr. Blair Levin.
Thank you very much.
Blair.
Thanks.
So Blair, how do you enjoy our conference so far?
It's been great. Thank you so much for having me.
It's such an honor for me to have you here, but more importantly, for this upcoming conversation you and I are about to have, right? If you think about Metaverse here, I have indeed learned a lot. So far this morning, we talked about different use cases. We talked about, from the ecosystem perspective. We talked about telco operators. But both you and I know there are probably many new things, just as when the internet was first coming on, that we haven't yet talked about. So for the next 25 minutes, we will put a short attempt here to at least touch on some of the topics. And I think, even if we cannot find the answer or the solution, at least we'll call on some awareness and invite more colleagues here in our community to help us figure this out.
Great.
You and I already been chatting about this for the last couple of days, and our list of things we thought we should mention gets longer and longer. So let's just start, and we'll see how far we can take down the list. I think the first thing I'm dying to hear your perspective here is about the foundational technology related to building the metaverse. Just like building anything, foundation is super important, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times, if you look back in history, and this is really your key research area, foundation technology makes a huge difference in how this new trend or new thing was getting evolved or getting adopted. So talk to us first here about what you see as the foundation technology related to metaverse, and how is that different from key technology wave we've seen in the past?
So I'm going to start by answering the question of what is it that we're not talking about, and I find it very curious. It was mentioned a little bit in the last panel, and this is just between us. The thing that's not mentioned at all, money. And I mean this in the following way. One of the key themes that I keep picking up is we need to make the network metaverse ready. We need this upgrade. Well, I served as chief of staff at the FCC when the internet began. I've seen a bunch of different upgrades. I actually participated in some of them in various ways. They were never driven by an app or a service. Rather, every upgrade of the network, with one exception I'll mention, that I witnessed, was driven by a competitive fear or by a regulator. That is to say, in the early days, we had the dial-up network, and then cable came on, and then the telcos had to upgrade to DSL. They'd had that DSL technology since the 1980s, and they didn't use it. Why? Because they made more money, to use that word again, within the dial-up world where they were selling 2 lines and things like that. And then the series of upgrades that we've had since then have been largely driven by various competitive forces. There was the situation where AT&T and Apple collaborated for the first iPhone. But that was actually somewhat unusual. And I would just say that the really good thing is in the first 20 years of the internet, the networks were a constraint on creativity. At this point, the network speeds and the bandwidth are largely faster than almost every use that's out there. And that was not true when we were doing the National Broadband Plan in 2010. The metaverse does require other things, including latency. But I kept listening and wondering, why would a network operator do that?
What's their motivation?
What's their motivation?
Yeah.
What's their incentive? Now, it was mentioned the other at the last panel that there has to be a way of revenue. I think it was like bringing the operators on and the revenues. I'm sure the operators would be happy to oblige by taking some of the money. But what's actually going on in the real world, I think, is that the operators are proposing a variety of ways that they get paid. The most prominent idea, I think, is something called sending party pays, where you have the content operator send money to the network operator. This has been proposed in a variety of different ways. It's being used in Korea, it's being urged in the EU. There's one FCC commissioner in the FCC who's been talking about that. Well, that would be a way of doing it, but that wouldn't necessarily, if you look at the South Korea example, I don't necessarily think that will solve the latency problem. So I would just say that one of the things you have to talk about, and they talked about it a bit on the last panel, is you have to develop a certain kind of partnership that overcomes what are essentially, from the operator's perspective, to be crass, they look at it and say they want to make all the money by by transmitting things on the networks that we pay for. And that I don't think is going to work. On the other hand, there are lots of different partnerships going on. We're early in the game, so it can come out. But unless you start really confronting the money issue, I don't know.
I think I absolutely agree with you. Like we talked about earlier, right? Many of the issues that we're here brainstorming, we know we're not going to solve that. We don't have things ready. But it's important to surface them. Right, put them on the table so that we collectively can address. I also remember this morning, I think it was Martha from Vodafone talked about, she used the word monetization, and I think it's very much related to this notion you talked about, right? Is as we're building the metaverse, there's going to be a set of technical requirements. The use cases, there's new use cases coming in. Let's say there's now going to be more layer 6 or 7, closer on the edge traffic, right, from a network perspective. And whether these use cases will invite new practitioners and players coming into this ecosystem, whether that would end up creating new revenue model, monetization approach, like the example of AT&T and iPhone you talked about there, right? I think there's just really a lot for us to explore and to think about here.
Yeah, and the one thing I will say, just again from a kind of an historical perspective on the use cases, is it really is hard to predict. We all know lots of bad predictions about things. I would simply note, as I saw some of the demos, I was thinking about, they all struck me as absurd, by the way, and of course I'm older by many years than probably everybody in this room, so I'm naturally going to think that some of the cases are absurd. But the early days of radio were fundamentally vaudeville routines in front of microphones. It took 10 or 20 years for radio really to develop what was radio content. The early days of broadcast television were just radio shows, literally radio shows. I Love Lucy was a radio show, basically, that then was put in front of cameras, and it took 20 years to have much more complicated things that television allowed. I think Hill Street Blues in the 70s was the first real show that did that. Streaming, Netflix, it took a while for them to kind of come to realize that they could tell much more complicated stories over much longer periods of time and without commercials, without that kind of every 10-minute break for them to do it. So the fact that we don't really have the great compelling content now, that doesn't worry me as much. But if we're going to depend on a network upgrade, we better solve that money problem earlier.
Yeah, I can absolutely see how you called out in this examples. It also reminds me of something, Blair. What you're describing here to me is also a journey of evolution, right? And where I can relate to, back in my infra or infrastructure cloud capacity role, right? I still remember, initially when we were getting into AOL emails, right? We're talking about fairly efficient, each email size there. From there, we get into web. And then, when we get to the 4G, I remember this huge bloom of smartphone apps, right? We all can relate to Uber, Airbnb, the video content back and forth, right? The fact that I get to check in with my mom, for the reason that I couldn't quite go visit them in person on a daily basis, and this is all through video.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I think now we have more and more of the 5G content. We start to talk about multiplayer streaming, stream gaming. But as we continue on here, right, with Metaverse, possibly doing real-time local rendering, right, this entire step-by-step is really an evolution that's taking us from, just gradually more and more. But I'll tell you what, this also concerns me. Why? I worry about not being able to keep up from a cloud capacity perspective, right? Because the packet size is just significantly, exponentially larger. And therefore, I think throughout the conference, what we've heard, our connectivity providers has a lot to do, has a lot cut out for them. That is equally true for me working on cloud infrastructure, working on that hardware, software combined end-to-end stack, and really thinking about how to optimize this entirely as part of this evolution journey here.
Yeah, and by the way, let me do one more quick historical thing. One of my favorite mispredictions was from the guy who was the most visionary person in the space, Steve Jobs, who when he introduced the iPhone in 2007, was asked why there wasn't like what we now think of as the App Store. And he said, everything we need is on the phone. And a couple years later, he realized the error of that and corrected, and that's what really opened things up to so many other uses. But one of the questions about the evolution and revolution that I really would love an engineering take on is, when we think of the metaverse, do we want it to be universal? And I might note that, in the early days, telephone was a luxury service, or was a very particularized service. In the early days of the internet, there was talk of the digital divide. But as recently as 2015, a commissioner at the FCC was saying, we can't make it universal. It's really a luxury item. We should want it everywhere. COVID changed a lot of minds. We had written that it ought to be a universal service back in 2009, but many people disagreed. But as we think about the metaverse, do we want it to be universal? Because if we do, then we kind of should be doing certain things.
Consideration.
And if we think no, it's just a bunch of applications that some people will like, but most people don't need, then we think of it very differently.
Yeah, and this reminds me of two thoughts here, right? You brought up such a good point, and I'll share each one of them. Number one is this morning, I was fascinated by this use case discussion. Were you there when we were having? I mean, look at not only gaming, but also all the non-gaming use cases that has been identified, right, by a group of, builders participating in this metaverse journey from multiple companies. That's super encouraging, and that's in a way, reflect the question you just raised, right? Should metaverse be universal? The other thing that I was thinking is back to the example you raised in pandemic, right? I really think it's the pandemic that made all of us realize how these, either it's social media platform or internet access, are becoming essential in our day-to-day lives, right? I remember, in my, doing my job during the early part of 2020, the usage rate, the user engagement rate jumped significantly, right? As people were in lockdown, people were in need of connecting with their family and friends. It's almost like we only used to see them a couple times a year, such as this week here, right? As some of the folks on the globe are celebrating Diwali, so we would see this engagement coming up. But that was happening throughout this entire pandemic, and you see regions, right? When Italy was doing lockdown, that picks up. And when these go up and down, right, thank goodness that I was super thankful from a connectivity perspective, our providers globally have really been able to hold the fort okay. But it's also pushing a lot of our infrastructure from a cloud perspective much closer to its limit or boundary. Right? We were monitoring these super carefully. We were mitigating a lot of risk along the way, including the supply chain issue, right? When you can no longer predict when that container ship with all of your servers are going to arrive at expected time. I think all of these coming together is highlighting what you've pointed out is, should this be universal or not, is becoming a much more crucial issue given, the pandemic we've just experienced.
it was interesting in the last panel, someone mentioned how Accenture and others are working with an insurance company to do remote healthcare. In February of 2020, less than 1% of Medicare visits were online. In April of 2020, over 40% of Medicare visits were online. Was there a technology shift between February and April of 2020? I don't think so, right? So that was really a change in the way people thought about it, and particularly seniors like myself, although I wasn't a senior then, had, realized that the most dangerous place to go would be to a hospital or a doctor's office.
Correct.
And so they started changing the use. But there was no technology change that you really needed. And I don't know, I'm not sure that I understand why a metaverse is necessary to do a lot of things that we can do. And that's why I ask whether the metaverse is by its nature something that ought to be universal. Because if it is, then we ought to be thinking about disability access. We ought to be thinking about diversity in a variety of different ways. But there's no doubt that COVID transformed the way people think about things, but it also created certain problems. And I was, in the last week, there have been a series of articles about how reading scores and math scores in the United States have dropped to the lowest level in 30 years.
I listened to that one too.
This is a huge problem.
Yeah.
A huge problem. It is widely believed, though apparently not necessarily 100% true, that any state can predict how many prison beds they will need 11 years from now by looking at fourth grade reading scores. And if that is accurate, then what we have is a population where we're going to have a lot more crime and a lot more needs for prison beds in 11 years, because our fourth grade reading scores are really low. And it strikes me that you could, and I know that Meta is doing some educational stuff, but it's at a much higher level of education. And if the metaverse's value is that immersion is more compelling, then we ought to be thinking about how we can teach kids to read.
and do math.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, look, we all know that the kids who know how to read tend to be those kids whose parents read to them. Well, the reality is that's not going to be everybody. But can we do something to make it better for those kids? That's a big problem. And I thought some of the applications were really interesting to me, but they weren't big applications.
Yeah.
And it would be nice to see something that was really taking on a really big societal problem. Helping surgeons become better surgeons, great, totally in favor of it.
Yeah.
But that's a relatively
More
small problem.
fundamental.
Yeah, but there's a much bigger fundamental problem. So frankly, the internet did address a number of things really well. Not sure I see how the metaverse improves on that yet, but again, it's early.
I will say on this point, Blair, I'm optimistic. Why? Because as internet became more and more accessible, right? A colleague of mine back in the United States, in the Bay Area, actually took internet technology, or in fact, it was the laptop, through power generator, right, back to his village of Nepal to focus on bringing education access, right, to those kids there. And I'm optimistic looking at what we've done and just listening to this morning's use case discussion and all that, right? Education, as you called out, such fundamental needs for our society in the global scale, right? Can be amazing use cases as we build the metaverse together.
Yeah.
But that's also exactly the reason I think, why we're bringing these up, because it's very unusual to think about, fourth grade math in a, TIP or Fyuz conference here. Yet it is actually indeed essential and probably deeply related to many of us, both you and I, but as well as our colleagues in this community as well.
So I'm going to be both pessimistic and optimistic. The pessimistic one is, and this is like an incredibly safe and tragic prediction. 10 years from now, there will be a far larger number of internally displaced or refugees in the world. And the reason is climate. And it's already causing huge disruptions. It's only going to get worse. But one of the things that we see with refugees now, and actually did a project with the UN High Commission on Refugees on broadband, and this is refugees. The phone is so incredibly valuable. As valuable as it is to you and me, to a refugee, it is such an important tool. And because it is the connectivity to their past, to their friends, to their family, to education,
and a lot of times to survival.
Yeah, so all of that. Now, whether you need the metaverse for that, I still don't know, right? But my point is, we're going to do a better job, with that part I'm optimistic about, in helping people under the most difficult circumstances thrive, not in the way they would wish to thrive, but thrive better than they would otherwise.
Yeah. I love your balanced view here, right? About calling out the potential risk, but also being optimistic about how to get out of it. And you just, Blair, reminded me of another topic, again, for what we're here to discuss, things that we haven't talked about. You mentioned the word climate change. And that reminded me of a topic that I personally feel extremely passionate about, and that is ESG, right? So ESG stands for environmental, sustainability, and governance. Now, in technology, most of us are very familiar about governance. But exactly how much have we done with environmental, with sustainability? And is Metaverse being an opportunity allow us going to do it way better? Or are we going to go way worse, right? I can tell you that I'm deeply concerned about it because from where I am, right, looking at my job as far as supplying infrastructure for the internet, right, the growth of demand has been growing exponentially. And quite frankly, if you look back for the last 15 years, I would say that first 10 years was relatively easy for people in my kind of job because of Moore's law. Like we could just leverage the ability for our hardware innovation, they're being able to catch up. But right now we're looking at hitting that limit boundary of physics. And for that reason, we see the diminishing impact from Moore's law that just if we continue to exponentially increase the number of compute servers or building out more global data centers only because Metaverse here is going to have a lot more and more data storage or local rendering and communication back and forth network bandwidth requests. That kind of answer is too simple and it will get us into a worse situation for ESG. So I really feel ESG is also a topic that we needed to put it on the table here and get all of us to work on that together.
Well, I think that's right. The one thing that I would just note that as to ESG, which is much more controversial and will be more controversial than it should be, is that it's fundamentally voluntary. That companies have recognized that stakeholders, including their shareholders, want to see the companies commit to certain kinds of things. But at the end of the day, there have to be rules, and the rules have to be enforceable. And another thing that has not been talked about at this conference is what should those rules be, and who's going to adopt them. Yeah. Let me tell you, here's what I think is going to happen, is that the states in the United States, and also local governments all around the world are just going to keep making up their own rules.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but I will note that Texas, for example, passed a law which I happen to think was unconstitutional, but the Fifth Circuit disagreed and ruled it constitutional. And if that stays in effect, Meta has a really big problem. And that California also passed a set of rules, and I think it's going to be really difficult to comply both with the Texas rules and with the California rules. And so companies like Meta will be playing a game of choose your plaintiff. Would you rather have plaintiffs in Texas or plaintiffs in California? That's really hard. I would note that Nick Clegg, who is in charge of these issues for Meta, wrote a very long and thoughtful piece about what the rules are. But he didn't address what I think of, having served in the government a couple times, and he of course served in the government too, some of the really core questions, which is, at what level do we want this stuff to be governed?
Yeah.
How is it going to be enforced? I mean, you can talk about, there's all these issues of anti-fraud and misinformation and safety and security and privacy and transparency. There's a ton of these issues. The internet has been relatively not regulated. I think those days are changing, and also, of course, the world is bifurcating. I mean, the internet arose just as the Berlin Wall was falling, and there was kind of what we might think of as a glorious period of a kind of a global economy for 30 years.
Yeah.
That appears to be ending. So there's a lot of different issues about the governance of all this that we haven't addressed here, but that absolutely have to be addressed.
I totally agree, and if I may add here is, as you talked about these issues, they're not only issues or challenges that, Meta, the company I'm working for, is dealing with. I really see these as fairly universal issue for anyone working in the metaverse, that they're facing these as well. I cannot believe we're running out of time already. Although you and I always know that we're going to have just simply too many topics, our intent here is really to put all of them on the table. All is just an attempt. I know we couldn't possibly get all, but that will hopefully get more of us to brainstorm, to collaborate, to figure out solutions, to experiment, right? To try one thing versus another. Maybe we can each share a one-sentence final thought just to wrap up the conversation for many more topics that yet to be discussed with Metaverse. I'll let you go first.
Well, I think this was said at the last panel, but I entirely agree. The business model for upgrading the network to be Metaverse ready is completely unclear to me. But the biggest topic is who governs.
That's lovely. And what I would share, now that you touched on governance and the business model, is I would touch on the diversities in Metaverse builders. I don't think that has been covered strong enough yet, right? As we talk about the variety, the complexity here, I strongly believe for us in the room, we need to have enough diversity, that different perspective, from all different angles in place, so that we think about these. We can build what we know, and if we don't think about these, if we don't have the context to even consider these, then that's going to become more challenging. Well, we certainly enjoyed the back and forth here. We hope you guys enjoyed. There's clearly a lot more to go through, so it's not our intent to provide solutions, but rather let us get started with such discussions. So with that, thank you so much, Blair. Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Amazing work. Thanks, Blair. Thanks, Jin, for bringing all these topics up. It was amazing. Guys, I have fantastic news for all of you. This is the last time you see me out here. We're going to start with the last session of the day. Thanks for being such an amazing crowd. We are going to discuss about a topic that has been part of the overall theme of the event. We're going to talk about building the metaverse together. For that, I want to welcome on stage Dan Rabinovitsj, VP of Meta Connectivity, and Roy Chua, founder and principal at Avid Think. Roy, Dan, please welcome on stage.
It's good to be back. Excellent. Well, Dan, thank you for taking time to spend with me over these really busy 3 days. It's been pretty intense, and a lot of learning, a lot of sharing going on. Are there any of these major themes you would like to highlight for the audience that maybe jumped out at you?
Well, there are a bunch of major highlights. I would say one of the big things that I took away, first of all, this was an amazing event, and I say that very humbly. We didn't know what we were going to get into when we tried to combine these 3 strands, and the 3 strands of DNA, I think, made a really, really nice meal. I'm going to just go full fusion here. But it was a remarkable event. One of the things that struck me was a number of the topics that we've seen brought up are really, first of all, pointing out that Open RAN is no longer just a pipe dream.
Right.
And it's clear that the momentum is in the industry. We see it, we can feel it. And other big things that have come up for us, we used to talk a lot about mobile RAN and the densification of the radio network. Now we're starting to talk about densification of the edge of the network. Mm-hmm. Little mini data centers. The conversation that Caitlin was hosting, we could see just a completely different conversation about moving the user plane functionality closer to people. How do we converge mobile and fixed networks? Some of those topics have been really, really fascinating. And as we've seen today, just the metaverse is a brand new thing. We should expect paradigm shifts and a lot of new things to emerge. We haven't figured it out, and no one company can dictate how this is going to emerge. So it's a great opportunity for industry collaboration. I'm delighted that we have a metaverse project group that's been initiated as part of TIP, and that's been pretty impressive. I think the last thing that really struck me, Roy, was we spend a lot of time on RAN.
Right.
But if you look at the core of networks, open optical, fiber, open Wi-Fi, and Wi-Fi in general, the importance of the home network as we look at the future, these topics are going to be just as visceral and important as the work that we've done on the radio network inside of TIP. So lots of fun and exciting stuff to look forward to.
No, I think that's excellent. Any interesting themes you've seen around startups in terms of what they're focusing on? Because certainly we've seen some big announcements here from the carriers that indicated momentum in Open RAN and other things as well, as you presented. But are there areas of innovation that you have seen or you might want to highlight in startups in radio innovation, for instance, or any of those that you think are worth talking about?
Well, I mean, you have, I think one of the best things about this conference is it's large enough that we can bring, lots of people who care about the same topic to passionately discuss it.
Right.
And it's small and intimate enough that startup companies like Radio Innovation, who are showing off kind of new antenna technology. I met with Domos, who are innovating in the area of telemetry and insights into what's happening in your home network. I think there's, I think it was Acromove, I hope I got your name right, who are actually talking about mobile edge data centers, and I saw a data center in a box today, which is pretty amazing. That opportunity for innovation now from smaller companies is coming together, which is very exciting, and I think as an industry we should be welcoming more small and nimble startups into this ecosystem.
Now, speaking of startups, on the other side, sort of the big companies. So, what do you think it means when companies like Dell, Intel, AMD, Marvell, Analog Devices, just name a few, are now indicating a commitment to the concept of disaggregated networks? What does that mean?
Roy, this is a sign. It's a sign that the available market for open and disaggregated is big enough that a company with the scale of a Dell, for example, who are a powerhouse in enterprise and growing market share, the fact that they see multi-billion-dollar TAMs in this telecom space is very, very encouraging. There's real business here. And I think a commitment to scale, the ability for companies with the scale of Intel, AMD, the fact that Marvell and ADI have been fully engaged in investing for the long term in Open RAN, for example, that's like a big deal.
Right.
Because if you think about the history of this entire industry, we've been heavily concentrated in a small number of companies supplying a vast multi-trillion-dollar industry. So as we start to see the real business interests of companies like that, it's just very encouraging. Now we got to get there, and we have a journey to go, but this is super encouraging.
Yep, that's fair. Excellent. Now, I know that we've seen a lot of things happen here. It's all been a lot of positive news. And I've spoken with a couple of folks in the audience, and they say, well, that's all great, but it's not all, it's like, well, maybe that's too optimistic, that's like a perfect view of things, right? So what would you say to that? Because there seems to be, as you say, there's a lot of work to be done, right? What's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, well, this morning in our Women in Telecom Industry brunch, which is a celebration of our pursuit of more diversity in this industry, we kind of talked about being uncomfortable and being comfortable with being uncomfortable. We have a long way to go. We should celebrate the small wins, and I would say, this past 3 days, we've seen a more diverse panel of speakers not only from a gender perspective, but really coming from lots of industries. I was delighted to see Microsoft and AWS, for example, well represented here as cloud players. But we should be very comfortable with the fact that we are uncomfortable with the progress we've made. And I think talking about it is good. We, as an industry, we have a very complex world that we're managing. The entire telecom industry is far more complex than, anything that we had to address when we were just looking at, for example, innovating in the data center, which is a complex space, but not nearly as complex as this. So, yeah, let's give ourselves a break that we haven't made as much progress as we would like. But now is the time for the CSPs to really make a commitment to scale out things like Open RAN, make sure that we are really caring and nurturing for the companies that are innovating in this space. And really the important thing is that flow of money, that show of support is incredibly important. Now, the big challenge I would say that we're still facing today that we had in 2019, integration, validation, and testing.
Right.
How do we get more efficient so that a company that's trying to deploy in commercial production doesn't have to go into every single operator's lab and 100 field trials before they're proven. Let's come together in TIP the way we've committed so that 80–90% of testing can be done in one lab environment and accepted by multiple operators. That is a huge change. If we can get there by next year when we're all together again, that's a massive win. That will accelerate real production deployment from a diverse and disaggregated ecosystem.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing from you is the word scale economies came up a few times the last couple of days. And what you're saying, in fact, is TIP can be a vehicle to enable those scale economies if the telcos will work together and the vendors too as well, right? And I think that's critical for making this happen because we can't ignore the fact there are scale economies. And things do get cheaper when they come together and have common blueprints that fit the vast majority of people's needs. And if we can do that through vehicles like TIP and through events like Fyuz, I think that's a success for everyone concerned. Right?
Agree.
Yeah, excellent. So fast forward to Fyuz 2023. What do you think we should be talking about by then, beyond what you just said?
Well, again, I think if we get to scaled deployments, if we get to all of the things we're trying to do with blueprints and badging and real commercial deployment, I think the next big thing is actually still coming back to people and process.
Right.
The innovation that's required to transform our workforce is, in a way, one of the hardest things we have to do. So I think TIP Academy, for example, is a really important piece of that puzzle because training our workforce to use new things is incredibly important, but also just accepting the fact that we aren't going to move the entire industry overnight unless we actually invest in the most important asset in all of our businesses, which is people. And that's a big transformation. So I think it's a good time to start stimulating that conversation right now inside of all of our companies. What do we need to do to prepare our workforce for this future? And the rate of acceleration is going to increase. Mm-hmm. If we look at today and all the conversations we've had about the metaverse, things are not going to stay the same. Like things are changing, and when people start moving your cheese around, you have to be able to go with that flow and adapt. That's all about people.
I think that's fair. So next year we would have seen the TIP Academy graduate a significant number of folks, and they're out there ready to help change the telcos for the new world. I think that's not a bad thing, necessarily speaking.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, we're coming up to the end of our conversation. Any questions for me, Dan? Let's reverse it. I'll give you one question. How's that?
I do want to ask you a question, Roy. You have basically been in the thick of things for the last 3 days. What are the one or two things that are your primary takeaways? If you walk out of the room and someone says, "What just happened, man?" 3 days of concentrated discussion.
Yeah, I would say, I think there is a reality that there is hard work to be done. There's no doubt about that. At the same time, there is, as you point out, clear momentum, right? From the access layer, the Wi-Fi, the RAN, through the transport, into the core, and upwards to the applications. And I don't think we've quite figured out the interface layer between the applications and the network yet, but we do know that the network has to get ready, has to get better, has to have clear, distinct milestones. So I think my takeaway is I'm hoping over the course of next year that collectively we set those stakes in the ground in terms of what we want to hit. And then whether they're right or wrong, you got to put a stake in the ground and work our way there. I think the second thing that struck me is seeing the organizations come together and collaborate. And I know it's not always smooth. Everyone has slightly different intents, different goals, and the like. But I think everyone collectively agrees that if you don't collaborate, then there is no good outcome for all of us concerned, right? And telcos, I wouldn't say they don't, you always have a choice. It's a lot better to work together than not. I think that's a better option. But as we build these networks, I think what I'm seeing around the world is that let's just make sure that this next generation of connectivity helps strengthen relationships, not weaken them, right? Helps to build communities, not isolate us. And the hope is that it helps reinforce society and humanity at the same time. And I think we have a chance to do that, right, as we go into the metaverse and maybe an improved internet. That's my view anyway. So
I love that view, Roy. It's inspirational.
Well, thank you, Dan. All right, well, with that, I shall leave you to do the closing keynote.
I will do that, but first I want to thank you. You've been an amazing master of ceremonies for this event. I got to know you quite well in the past month or so as we prepared for this, and I've just been so impressed and very thankful for your help today. I would like everyone to give Roy
thank you, Dan.
A big round of applause. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
All right. I'll
Cheers.
leave you be. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. All right. I'm standing between you and aperitifs or your flight home. So I want to talk a little bit about what Roy was touching on, which is about building this metaverse together. And it really, unless we didn't say it enough times today, it's really obvious that the metaverse is a collective-owned thing. The history of our industry is really interesting, and I'm going to just say, I started my career on the left side of this chart. My first work was in plain old telephone system, telephone exchanges, big iron. And one of the things that I loved about my job was I knew that somebody somewhere was making their first phone call using the silicon that I had worked on in a telephone exchange. And it was transformational, and a lot of that work was in emerging markets. And it gave me a certain sense of accomplishment just knowing that the work I was doing was actually connecting people who were distant for the first time. But whoa, that's not at all impressive when you look at the history of what's happening. And as we move to the personal computer age, that was actually the inspiration for Wi-Fi. How do you share an internet connection when you finally got the internet after personal computing started? You needed a way to share that internet connection with multiple devices, the birth of Wi-Fi. And then all of a sudden, we had the mobile internet, which just completely transformed all of our lives in a way that I don't think we really realized as an industry. That democratized bits, it democratized access to information at a scale that we've never seen before. And I will just point out, if you think about the history of Reliance Jio in India, that brought 800 million people online faster than we've ever seen in any other event. So this industry we're in, it is transforming lives. And when we look at these transformations, they're absolutely amazing, right? Before the telephone, you had to physically go see someone to have a conversation with them. Once we get to the mobile internet, big change. Now we're about to jump onto this thing called the metaverse. And I hope after today you are not confused that this will be just as big a transformation with all the attendant challenges and change that came with every one of these other transitions. So what do we need to do to get ready? So number one, we need a common taxonomy about telemetry, metrics. How do we measure what network is ready for certain kinds of experiences? And how do we have the same language so that we can talk about this in a very productive way? This is going to be a big opportunity for us in the next year. I also believe this is great work that we can do in TIP, but as an industry, we need to get on board with measurement and metrics. It's a foundation. If I can't measure what I'm doing, I can't express it to anybody else, and vice versa. The other big theme here is, hey, you know, latency is a big deal, as we've heard multiple times across the panel sessions. So that edge has to get closer to users because we just need to get latency down for some of these use cases. AR is not going to be a big part of our network device ecosystem for a long time. It's going to be 28, 29, or 2030 before we see hundreds of millions of AR devices on our networks. But when that time comes, we better be ready with really, really low latency because these are use cases that really demand it. By the way, we can't stop just doing our normal jobs. We have to keep building out more capacity. We have to make sure that there's coverage for people where they need it. So all of these things that we're already working on, fiber to the home, building out the 3GPP networks, 5G and beyond, and of course Wi-Fi, which continues to iterate at a blazing pace, right? We're already looking at Wi-Fi 7, and I've got 6E plus on the slide, so you know I'm already behind by the time I published, right? So that industry moves really, really quickly. And then finally, last but not least, and we had some really good conversations about this, we need to understand how the business models are going to work for this. It's not obvious right now. And I think a lot of our speakers have pointed out that this is a brave new world, and sometimes in a brave new world, we got to figure out how we're going to manage all of this complexity. So we've got a bunch of big questions that have been raised. First of all, where do we start? Mass scale adoption is a while away. So I feel like it's important to focus on these paving stones to get to the universe. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting about this as we measure the progress is to figure out for the industry, what are these milestones that are important for us, and how do we mark those so that we're not just kind of in an open loop talking about all of these things. The metrics are critical, but it's also about where do we want to be, and I think events like this can actually give us time to reflect and say, in 1 year, it would be great if we could all have clarity on all of the use cases that are going to emerge in the next 2 years. And then how are we going to start building for those use cases, and how do we start to change the architecture and the deployment model to support it? I'm just throwing out some ideas. How do we get to a distributed edge? Bringing the edge closer is actually a lot of work, and we're going to have to figure this out piece by piece. All of these are critical questions for the industry to address, and I think it's our job when we all go home and we have time to reflect to start thinking about this. Now, momentum is building in the industry, so Open RAN, clearly this week, I think one of the best things is that we actually formally solidified the O-RAN and TIP Open RAN universe, so we're all pulling in the same direction. I thought that was wonderful that we came together in this event to do that. And the momentum around Open RAN is awesome. The release of all the roadmaps and the test and validation blueprints kind of solidifies that we have a path now to scale deployment. Again, just coming back to my conversation with Roy, please, let's commit to do that. This should not be, always moving target. We have to commit to the scale deployments. OOPT has done amazing. So the Open Access Network subgroup was established. I think that is a really good way to start having the conversations about, the fiber portion of moving the edge closer to users, and I think that's amazing. Open Wi-Fi. For me, one of the most amazing journeys is how fast Open Wi-Fi has taken off. It's won a ton of awards, which is great, but more importantly, I think for CSPs, this represents a whole new revenue stream of managed services based on something that's open, disaggregated from day one. the business model around open Wi-Fi and the capabilities of the technology are just perfect for this community. I hope we get to see a lot more momentum around Wi-Fi because it is where 80 to 85% of traffic is. And what was great this week was I think all the CSPs I talked to said it's really important that we have great home Wi-Fi networks. It's also great that we have Wi-Fi networks in public venues, et cetera. So this is a moment where TIP can be more expansive around our commitments to other technology stacks like optical and Wi-Fi. And finally, I'm very happy that we kicked off a Metaverse project group. We've got a lot of work ahead. I want to thank the people who are participating in that. What's important now in the next year is please lean in and contribute to that project group. It's very important that we actually start getting more ideas and more collective wisdom around that. So where are we going to go next? Obviously, we have to collaborate. I talked about that. Baselining today's use cases is actually really important. So I often talk about this with my colleagues at work. If we can't make over-the-top video calls perfect, we're not going to get to holographic calling in 4, 5, 6 years. We have a lot of work to do on problems of today to make them really, really, really good. And so I think understanding things that are core to our current use cases like real-time communications and figuring out how do I close the loop between the quality of service metrics on a network and the quality of experience in the application for the people that are using that. That's like very, very important. I spoke with a company today that described this as a quality of outcome. I love that, because what we want is great outcomes, and we need to be able to relate that back to our hardcore technical community so we can define what that looks like. Let's pursue clarity on future use cases and their network requirements. So, think about this as if we're going to do cloud rendering for a rock concert, and instead of 20,000 people that get to attend, it's 3 million. How are we going to support that? How are we going to support that from a network perspective? How are we going to support that from a device perspective? These are like really interesting opportunities, and I would argue they're also like business opportunities for a lot of folks. So let's take a look at that. Which brings me to my last point, which is we have to balance the tech and the business model innovation. As much as we love technology, the business models are just as important, and having those conversations kind of running in parallel are pretty critical because one may influence the other. And I hope that we're brave enough in this forum to be able to have those conversations. With that, I'd like to show you a little bit about how we're thinking about this, and I hope that you enjoy this video.
Connectivity. It's changing how we collaborate, how we learn, how we play, and how we'll work in the metaverse. Together, we can accelerate it. Within the next decade, our hope is that the metaverse will reach more than 1 billion people. The potential is infinite. One day we'll have new business opportunities, ways to create, educate, and connect. This future depends on reimagining connectivity infrastructure, defining network readiness for the metaverse and how we'll measure it, and moving the edge of networks closer to people. We'll all play a part. Engineers, business leaders, and those of us in roles yet to be realized. A connectivity ecosystem that provides the underlying fabric to enable experiences. Faster, more resilient. Together, we will build the future of connectivity.
All right, with that, I would just like to finish by having a moment of gratitude. There are so many people behind the scenes here who did enormous amounts of work to bring this event to life, and I want to just say thank you to all of you. I can't name the 150 names individually. You know who you are. The hosts, TIP, ORAN Alliance, all the sponsors that came together to provide funding for this, who showed up, put our booths, engaged all week long. That was awesome. And of course, our speakers and delegates, thank you so much, because the participation in all of the breakout sessions and on the main stage has been phenomenal. I've gotten more feedback, positive feedback about this event than just about any other one I've ever participated in, so I'm feeling really, really thankful that we were able to pull this off. And I want to thank all of you for attending and leaning in, enjoying the food. All of our hosts in Madrid as well. This is a great city to have an event in, and just very, very thankful for that. With that, I want to say see you next time. Enjoy and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Cheers.